Mhm. Hello, and thank you for having me.
We're in for a really interesting conversation today, and I'm super excited. And before we get done, I would love for you to take five, 2, 3 minutes to introduce yourself, your background, and uh, kind of why we're here talking today about data visualization.
Yeah, sure. I'm Jesse Jordan. I'm a senior front-end engineer working at Meroxa. I have joined the team in April of this year, so I haven't actually been working at Meroxa for like too long, but I already had like a really great time here with the team, building like the product and also our main platform. And before and also before yeah joining Meroxa already did a lot of like work in front-end development, also like in open source realm, and also yeah, working, for example, in the Ember.js community. And yeah, just like really feeling passionate about like front-end development in general. And today we also wanted to get together to talk a little bit more about like front-end development and also what we can do there with data visualization. So I'm really curious to yeah, kind of like get into this conversation with you and see what we can find. Oh, I can't hear you right now. Yeah. Yeah, technical things always are part of
How was that?
the streaming experience. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. There we go. You able to hear me now, Jesse?
Yes. Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, look at that. There's
Listen.
no good live webinar without audio visual issues, isn't that? Yeah,
Exactly.
and so the reason why we wanted to focus on data visualization is because at on the surface, it seems like such a simple problem, but once you start to get into the weeds and start to figure out, how to build the best visualization or build the right tool chains to present the visuals in the right way, or how do you even know you're making the right dashboard, there's a lot of questions that are involved in putting some data on the screen. So, as we start to unpack these, I would love to start this conversation with one question for you. So, when you're sitting down and you're creating a visualization, and before you even hop into any tools, um, walk me through your process. Are you thinking about certain people in mind and who are involved in the process? Where does your visualization process begin? I shall say.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, like in an ideal scenario, you might start like as a front-end engineer or like as a full stack engineer, building out this data visualization, already having like everything that you need to kind of like make it a success, right? So you might have like a very clear kind of like question that you want to answer from maybe a business stakeholder, maybe someone working product, maybe someone else on your team actually who wants to get like better insight into what's happening currently on the platform or with the product or in general like with the team. And then you would just like take the data that is already there and kind of like already formatted and prepared in a way that you can just like use it and kind of like transform it into a visualization. And you might already have one kind of like way or mechanism to actually deliver this data to your client side application, right? So these are
Mm-hmm.
all like different kind of like parameters that should be in place for you to actually be able to build this visualization and then actually gain like value from it, right? Because like visualizing data is always about like trying to get like insights from data by making it like a little bit more presentable and trying to make it presentable in the way that someone can actually look at it and kind of like already go like, oh, now I actually get like a new understanding about the data that I couldn't have gotten
Right.
if I would have just looked at a table or something. Um, if this makes sense, right?
Yeah. And I like how you broke that down because it immediately kind of breaks down into the types of visualization that I see all the time. And we have to treat them as same but different. so you have your application UI, and this might be, the dashboard, right? Like that you're looking at you from a customer, right? This might be you're building a dashboard as a front engineer for customers to look at, to observe something generally. And then there's also kind of this like internal visualization where we might be looking at, like you said, some sort of business metric. And now I'm using this visualization to derive some sort of insight to answer a question. So these seem like two sides of the coin, but I would love to continue to talk about these as we go along. But from these perspectives, whether I'm building like a front end engineer, an application UI, or I'm building some visualization to enter some business level metrics, who are the stakeholders? So who should I be thinking about in both of these scenarios? Are they same? Are they different? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm actually not entirely sure like how different they are. I mean, like obviously, if you create like a data visualization like for an external use case, probably like the main stakeholder or like the person who actually wants to get insight from the data will be like a customer, some kind of like end user from it. Whereas like if it's internal, it could be a lot of like different people like on your team or like also in different departments working at the company trying to get like insight into data. And yeah, going from there, I think in this whole kind of like pipeline of actually kind of like generating the data, delivering this data, and also kind of like presenting the data, there are a couple of like different people involved. But I think like these are probably very similar on both kind of like sides of like data visualization being like external, internal, right? So you would have like people who actually need to generate like the data or kind of like aggregate the data in some kind of like way that is like relevant for the question at hand. Then you would also have like people who are like data engineers, data scientists, who actually have the expertise to help you to bring this data in some kind of like format, prepare it in some kind of like way that it can actually kind of like create like more insight. And then later on, you might also have like backend engineers, for example, who actually build like REST APIs or WebSocket services that can actually deliver this data as well, like to different clients. And I think these kind of like constellation of people who are involved in the entire process of like getting the data to an actual visualization and to some kind of like answer are fairly similar, I think, like for external and internal applications. But then again, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about this?
I love the breakdown because I think, you have your data producers, and this could be a person or a machine, a customer, or something that the customer is doing. And then you have your data engineers, which is, a newer model, right? Because they're deriving insights, collecting this data, figuring out what are the right questions. And some of those insights may be for customers, some of those insights may be for internal users, some both. And then you're right, then you have this backend person that may actually then build the API to deliver to the front end person who will then put this on a chart, and then the consumer will then go and look at it. I think what's interesting, kind of describing it in that way, is when we're building an internal use case, meaning that we might want to understand, how many times are our customers clicking on this button. The front end engineer is actually the data producer, because they might have to put tooling in place to track the button click. But for the customer facing, the application UI facing, visualization, the customer is the data producer or some machine. So it's kind of interesting. I think when you think of it, when you break it down in that manner as you describe, it helps this planning process. It helps us actually figure out who we're building a visualization for and what's the right next step. So speaking of the right next step, now I think we get into, we've painted the picture. So we know why we may want to create a visualization, expose some data to our customers, expose some data back to ourselves. And we know who's involved, the stakeholders. So really the next obvious question I think it comes in is, what tools should I use? How do you think about, what are your thoughts next on, are there certain classes of tools, or how should I then now move into the tooling part of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I can imagine you could look at this like from several angles, right? You could, for example, first of all, ask yourself which kind of like tools are out there, or which kind of like categories of tools are out there, depending on who's the actual user of the tool, right? So if you, for example, are a business stakeholder, maybe you're working somewhere like as a lead of like a department, and you want to get like better insight about like what's currently happening with the work, and you want to visualize like this kind of like data, for example, like as a report or as some kind of like tool that you can use in a presentation to present like to other departments in the company, you might be like, yeah, maybe not like a front-end engineer necessarily, and maybe you don't want to actually build like your own web applications to visualize this data. And I think in this realm, a lot of like already ready-to-use tools come into handy, like any kind of like software as a service products, also just like very classic products such as Excel or like PowerPoint, which basically everyone has like used before, right? It's like the kind of like classic tool, but it's like also like a data visualization tool if you think about it, right? You can kind of like create charts in it, right? And line graphs and everything. So this is something you might want to look into. And then also there are like more dedicated and also like fine-grained kind of like tools like Tableau, for example, that help you to actually generate like more sophisticated kind of like data visualizations. And then on the other hand, of course, you have like also more software engineering focused tools, right? So if you, for example, know, oh, okay, like I'm actually like a front-end developer, or I'm a full stack developer, or at least like I'm kind of like comfortable working with JavaScript in general. Like I think probably the more, maybe most convenient, most popular, maybe most common tool you want to go for is like D3.js. And then if you look at D3 specifically, you might also find you can, first of all, like just like use the standard library, build your own kind of like tools, maybe like also around it to kind of like use D3 to create like charts and graphs and any kind of like visualizations. But then you can also, like as an application developer, go out in the world and find in the open source realm a lot of like different tools that are built on top of like D3.js to already provide you with like very easy to use components for your application that you can just drop in and maybe configure a little bit, but you don't have to go through the whole maybe like a little bit hassle in the beginning to kind of like learn about D3, like what does the API look like, what do I actually have to use to kind of like create my first pie chart. And this might also be kind of like helpful if you're just like getting started with maybe creating a dashboard or just in general kind of like visualizing data, if you're kind of like not really sure yet if you want to go for the most flexible solution and just like use D3 right way. But yeah, I think this is just like one kind of like insight. There are probably like a lot of like other tools you could also use.
I love that. You got some nice categories here, Jesse. And kind of repeating this back, I'm a software engineer. I now need to put data on the table. I have choices from the most flexible, so D3, and heavy on the engineering side, and then all the way up to, I wouldn't say least flexible, but least maybe customizable in that flexibility way. And then you have like Tableau and Retool and Excel that also count as data visualization tools. How would you make the call whether, I'm a software engineer, how do I now decide what direction I need to go?
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, maybe this is like a little bit more I mean, there are like, of course, like a couple of like things that are kind of like generic, where you could say this kind of like makes sense, like as a question to ask yourself, like which tool should I use, right? For example, questions like how much time do I actually have to put this visualization together, right? So if you have like a meeting tomorrow and you kind of like know, I actually want to show this prototype of like a really cool visualization dashboard, and I already have the API and everything, I really just need a couple of like these charts, right? And you already know that most of the things that you want to visualize probably will use some of the more common kind of like chart types, like maybe a bar chart, maybe a couple of like pie charts, or anything that's a little bit more kind of like usual that you would usually see like in the visualization, and not something like a heat map or like a box plot or something like this, right? Then maybe you want to go with like a higher level kind of like tool, maybe even some kind of like component library that already provides you with these bar chart components like out of the box. But if you, for example, know, oh yeah, actually we want to build like a longer term feature with regards to visualization in our product, I'm just like getting started, and I could really lay like a really good foundation for like even more sophisticated visualization as you go on, and I don't have to, if the question comes up maybe from design and product, to kind of like say, hey, can we do this really cool fancy kind of like chart that is like updatable in real time, and that could maybe also have like different kind of like segments to it depending on which kind of like tab you're clicking. Then you might go like, yeah, maybe I'll actually sit down, take some time, really get a little bit more familiar like with D3, for example, and really maybe handcraft my own solutions. What do you think? Yeah, do you think there are like also like other things people should consider here?
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think it's time and effort. Uh, Tools like D3 are super awesome, but they do have a learning curve. But I also think, to your point too, we have to consider table as visualization tools as well. So like maybe sending all of my data to Snowflake, where Snowflake gives me a way to query this and put it on a table, might be the visualization I need to answer the question that I have. So you're absolutely right. However, I heard from a little birdie that you had some demos or examples to show.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I can also like share my screen to show you.
Yeah. Let me put that on the screen real fast.
Yeah, because before we got like into this conversation, I was kind of like thinking what are actually kind of like things like more specifically to the visualization layer that you might want to be kind of like aware of when you create data visualization. And I think there's probably like, there could be like a list of 100 to-dos and not to-dos, right? So it's not about like being super exhaustive here, just like showing like a couple of examples and kind of like seeing what the issue here is and kind of like what we can actually make better and what we maybe can also pay a little bit more attention to when we create like visualizations, right? And just like super
Yeah,
examples here, yeah. So
because
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was going to say, yeah, this is very important because, we talked about, why I need to make a visualization when we've kind of discussed about the tools, but there's also this element of choosing the right visual. Because if you don't, to answer the right question, really the solution is to start all over again. So to do the work all over again. So, this is a very important thing that you're bringing up. Is we also have to answer the question the best way. So I love this. This is super awesome. I'm excited.
Yeah, fully agree with you as well. That's like very important to kind of like have like a mindset about like which kind of like chart or which kind of representation really kind of like suits the needs that I currently have to answer like a data-driven question. And for example, one thing that I notice is like pie charts, for example, are kind of like very popular. People really like to use them to just like show distributions of like different groups like in a set of like data points. And something that I, for example, also just like recently learned, and which is like actually quite important, is that you should also be aware like how you represent this pie chart with regards like to the actual segments. Right here, for example, we see now this one example where we have like these several slices of the pie like next to each other. But maybe when you compare it like to the next example, it's kind of like a little bit difficult to discern like how wide the slices really are, right? Because they're like very far from each other, right? And probably if you're using like a charting library, it already comes out of the box that it looks a little bit more like this, right? Which you want to kind of like go for because it's like much easier just like for the human eye to parse and to understand what the proportions are of the slices. So these are just like these tiny kind of like little tweaks you can go for if you create a visualization and you really want to make sure that the way that you represent the data is not misleading to the reader, if this makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thinking about just overall spacing and how the data that you're representing is reflected in that chart.
Exactly. And also like one other common thing that you might see as well, like in pie charts, is maybe something like this, right? Like, I don't know, like I also like just like left on purpose, like all the labels like over here, right? Just like, to be like, to show what the problem is. Like you have like maybe a data set with like maybe a bazillion different categories, right? You try to put it into a bar chart, but actually it's not like maybe you could argue it's maybe not even like the best way to represent this kind of like data. Maybe a table would almost make more sense like for these other categories over here, right? But this is really not really suitable for anyone, right? Because now you kind of go like, okay, what is all of this? Maybe I can hover over this, or maybe you could also have a legend. But even if you have the legend, still a little bit weird to kind of like have all the labels kind of like go out here and be like, okay, not really sure what you want to tell me with this chart, right? And these kind of like instances, for example, it's also kind of interesting to see that even if you have like some kind of like data set that is not like fully perfectly shaped for you to have like the best visualization, you on the front end or you kind of like creating visualization can also decide to actually re-aggregate or group like data together, so it is actually like better consumable like for the user, if this makes sense.
And this is perfect because I can see this being super useful in the case where the question that I'm answering with this visualization is around, out of a certain distribution, what are most popular or what stand out the most. Then this chart works. And to your point, if I was mostly looking at the distribution itself and how each one are comparative to each other, that should just be in a table, because it's the information fidelity that you would get in the pie chart is just unreasonable. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly, and fully agree with really keeping like a focus like on the actual question really makes it also easy to see, well, this is like much more easier to parse if I want to understand what's the most popular pet, for example, that people use, right? Yeah. And then also one thing that I found like super interesting, like after seeing a talk just like recently by a colleague of mine, like Agat Badia, she kind of like mentioned that it's like also very interesting to see like what color actually kind of like does in visualization, right? Because it doesn't even matter if it's like a pie chart, can also be like a line chart or whatever. In many of these instances, we kind of like rely a lot like on color to be like the determining factor about like which data we're currently looking at, right? And she showed me actually like this trick. You can go like into Google DevTools, like in your Chrome, for example, if you're using like this browser. And then you can here in the here in the side panel, go to more tools and then also click like on rendering. And then if we go here, we have like a lot of like different emulators basically that help us to understand, okay, what we're actually currently building here. And I think like since a couple of years, they added like this new emulator for like vision deficiencies. And so with this kind of like emulator, you can basically on the website kind of like emulate how like a chart or whatever you're building is currently looking like for someone who, for example, is like colorblind, right? And this is like super interesting because color blindness is actually not that kind of like unique. I think like in the US, for example, around like 8% of like men and around like 0.4% of women. So it's like a very kind of like Y chromosome kind of like focused. I'm actually not sure if it's like Y chromosome kind of like focused, but it's like more present in male populations.
It's okay. We do computers, not doctor stuff.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And something just to keep in mind because it's actually not so rare. And if we, for example, look into here, we have like different kinds of like emulators, and one for them is, for example, like protanopia and deuteranopia. So these are basically the most common kind of like types of color blindness that you can encounter. And if you, for example, click in here for the protanopia, then we directly can already see how our chart looks like. It's basically very hard to kind of like really distinguish which parts are actually which. And this doesn't matter so much, like if you, for example, had like labels like on the chart pies itself. But if you just have a legend like with the colors, you can already see, well, it's like very hard to consume this, right?
Right.
If I actually cannot see like the colors, right? And very similar as well, like for deuteranopia, like one other common kind of like color blindness that people suffer from. And here also very similar, right? A couple of like color gradients can be distinguished, but the red-green distinction that we had before, so if we do like no emulation like this one, for example, or this, it's entirely like lost. And with this regard and with this like in mind, it's, I think, like also important to understand that you can use like, besides like color, a lot of like other things, for example, like labels to indicate what a chart is about. Or you can, for example, also choose to use like more kind of like lightness and darkness kind of like focused distinguishment between like pie slices, for example, in your chart, to really make sure that even if someone doesn't see like the full spectrum of colors. They can still
Mm-hmm.
consume it, and your colleague who might be colorblind doesn't have to write you this email and kind of be like, what is this about? Like, which one is which, right?
I didn't even know this tool existed. This is super cool because you're right. Like, it's not, again, way more to data visualization than we initially expected. Accessibility. How do we not only answer the question, but make sure that our question is being answered by the most number of people that we can? This is awesome. Are there any other resources around like accessibility that you would recommend people go and to dive into this topic a little bit more? I know that's this might be a hard question to derive an answer to. Might be something we can provide like some links or resources after this session.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely look up a couple of like resources. I think like specific colorblind is probably the talk that I talked about by Gad Badia about like color blindness emulators. Probably like a really great intro to this topic. Maybe you can also share this one. And other than that, I think there are a couple of like in general, just like online resources are really great. And also with regards to accessibility in general, I think like everything by Leonard Watson, who's like a very big like advocate for like web accessibility specifically, is just really great to just like, get an insight into the topic. But yeah, also happy to share like more after the session.
Yeah, this is awesome. See, these are great demos. These are awesome demos. Thank you so much. Okay, I have one more question for you. And this is kind of the next step in our data visualization process because we've talked about the why, we've discussed some tools, we've discussed some best practices that I would say apply to all of the tools, really. And now we're getting into, I want to say, the delivery mechanism of the visualization, because one part of the visualization is how does data get from whatever the source is to the tool or system that is now putting it on a chart. Why is this a topic that as a software engineer I should care about and ask myself individually from the other ones?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you also mean like, why should I ask the question both like at the front end and the backend engineer, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think like a lot of like businesses currently like rely on not only like a single client, right? So they're kind of like in the realm of, oh, we have like a native app, we have like a mobile app, we have like a desktop web application. And with this regard, I think it becomes like even more kind of like important in general how to think about like how you want to deliver anything like between your actual service and to these kind of like clients. And I think it's like also important like for data. And I have the impression there it becomes like even more important to kind of like first of all think about how can we update our clients like accordingly and kind of like in a very quick manner with like data that is available that might be helpful for the end user in some kind of like way. And this can, for example, have just like the form of like a basic REST API, right? So there might be like REST APIs that our clients can consume to actually get access to this data. Might also be in the realm of like WebSocket services, right? So this might also be interesting if you're working like with real-time data. You don't want to just like do like polling, for example, to kind of like get your data from A to B. And I think, in this kind of like context, it kind of like makes sense also like as a front engineer to think about like where do I actually get my data from, and also like as someone who's building APIs or kind of like services for clients to think about what makes most sense and what is kind of like very easy to integrate as well, like for these.
Yeah, I find that it kind of, this is now where we get into where we blur the line between visualization and reporting, because I think the real time meter changes. Because, you know, if I'm doing a visualization for an application UI, to your point, that delivery mechanism might be some WebSocket, gRPC, some pub sub to the client that's constantly feeding the dashboard as the data is coming in real time. But I can also do like a second degree step where, you know, it's in small batches coming in to my visualization, probably
Mhm.
through a mechanism like polling, right? I can
Mhm.
poll for small batches every 5 minutes. And so some may argue, depending on how real time you want to get, that may be real time. And
Mhm.
then you kind of push into where, okay, I might be seeing this information once a week, and that's really a larger batch, right? So then how do you query that batch? And then now you have like, maybe longer term reporting, like a year. That's even a larger batch. And kind of the spectrum of delivery changes over that because the tools and how they need to process and deliver the data changes as you move up kind of the real time or batch. So I find it like that's kind of why we have to think about this is because, well, how often does your user want your data? And that will greatly affect how you decide to deliver the data to whatever client
Mhm.
that is or whatever tool that is and how often. Um, I think I mentioned this in some blog post I wrote a long time ago. No one wants to look at a dashboard from yesterday. So in a lot of use cases, the more real time is the best. However, but if I'm monitoring something that only really needs my attention on a weak fidelity, right? Then maybe real time might not be the best. But still, the thing it's really more of a delivery problem, not a which one is more better or worse. If that makes sense, it's kind of
Mhm.
how I think about these things.
Mhm. Yeah, that definitely totally makes sense. Yeah, and it's kind of like also interesting, kind of like to think about like this difference between like reporting, for example, and like actual real time kind of like visualization, and in which kind of like intervals users actually need to have like the data like as fresh as possible, kind of like available, and take this
Hmm.
into consideration for delivering the data and also like displaying the data. Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Jesse, this has been such a beautiful and wonderful conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I know all of our viewers who are watching this live and uh, on YouTube will have learned a lot as well. Thank you so much. Are there any parting words or last minute ideas you'd like to leave the audience?
Yeah, I didn't prepare any. I'm sorry, but yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. It was like amazing to chat with you. And yeah, see you around next time. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Everyone, thank you so much for watching us today to talk about data visualization. Be sure to check out next month. Next month, we have a really awesome conversation ready to go around snapshots. I would love to have you all there. Stay tuned for an announcement on that if you have any other questions about what's coming up. Otherwise, I appreciate your time, love, energy, and attention. Have a beautiful day.